Welcome to the Venezuelanalysis podcast. I'm your host, José Luis Granados Ceja. The Venezuelanalysis podcast brings independent, on the ground, English language coverage of Venezuela and the Bolivarian process. You'll hear news and in depth analysis about the country, as well as coverage of leftist and grassroots forces. With another year behind us, Venezuelanalysis is conducting a special podcast episode where we will once again take stock of the Venezuelan political landscape. And there were some pretty major developments this year, and Venezuela is actually currently in the headlines as a result of this territorial dispute with Guyana. But I'd actually like to start elsewhere with what I consider to be the most important development, which is sanctions relief. And today I'm joined by the Venezuelanalysis team, Andreína Chávez, Ricardo, and Cira Pascual Marquina. So, in October, the US Treasury Department issued a 6-month license allowing production, investment, and sale in the Venezuelan oil, gas, and gold sectors. But of course, this was not an act of humanitarian compassion, just a change in strategy. In their announcement, they made sure to say that they were prepared to amend or revoke authorizations at any time should the Biden administration, and I want to underline this, unilaterally determine that the Venezuelan government has not followed through on agreements. And on December 4th, just a few days prior to the recording of this conversation, U.S. State Department spokesperson Matt Miller said the following, quote, "So they have not gone through with their part of the bargain. These are 2 additional steps that we want to see them take. We want to see them release political prisoners, and we want to see them release wrongfully detained Americans. We are considering the matter and will suspend some of the sanctions relief that we put in place earlier this year if we determine that adequate progress to the commitments they made to us have not been made." End quote. So my question to everyone, how seriously should we take these threats? Does U.S. policy towards Venezuela actually obey other factors? For example, the stability of oil prices? What do you think?
Yeah, let me take that. And first of all, I agree that sanctions relief is indeed the major news or the major development that we saw this year. But you're right. I mean, you said in the premise that this change of strategy was not owed to any kind of humanitarian compassion. It was really a more of a change in strategy given the circumstances. So on one hand, we are 6 years past the beginning of Trump's maximum pressure campaign, and we remember the whole Guaido interim government story. And this was really, all out strategy of trying to strangle the Venezuelan economy and trigger regime change. And then, once the Biden administration came into office, there were very public, if anonymous, uh, acknowledgments that this strategy didn't work. So the Biden administration was clearly looking for a new strategy without losing sight of their ultimate goal, which is to get rid of the Bolivarian revolution. So there are several factors in place. On one hand, the global energy markets. There's a conflict in Ukraine. There's the unfolding genocide in Palestine, which can spread instability across the Middle East. And Biden is running for re-election, and there's nothing scarier than high fuel prices in that context. So that's clearly something that the U.S. officials have in mind. But it's not just that; it also has to do with trying to give a leg up to the Venezuelan opposition, trying to find a way for them to save face and return to the political game. And also, if we look at how not just the sanctions architecture, but also the way these licenses work, they're very much tailor made to benefit foreign corporations and, in particular, US corporations. So I think we should take these threats seriously because, the US is not going to just recognize Maduro and leave Venezuela alone, but they respond to other calculations. And at the same time, the most important license, which is the one that allows for sale and investment in the oil sector, that expires in April. That was the one temporary license. And so it's very possible that the US is then going to reimpose these sanctions as a way to make life more difficult for the government in the run-up to re-election. So there are several factors at play, and some may become more or less important over time. But the overall message is that the US is looking after its own interests and especially its desire to get rid of an unfriendly sovereign regime here in Venezuela. And that's what their sanctions policy is going to respond to.
Yeah, there's something I want to clarify first because the US has been saying that there are wrongfully detained Americans in Venezuela, and the US citizens detained in Venezuela are not innocent people that we just happen to have in prison. These are mercenaries, people who try to invade Venezuela, who plan to kill the president, to impose a regime change operation. So there is no such thing as wrongfully detained Americans in Venezuela. And second, I agree with Ricardo that I think we should take seriously the threat of having sanctions relief suspended. And this is something that I don't see happening soon. But for example, if Maduro wins the elections in 2024, I am positive that the United States government is going to impose sanctions again. And hopefully Venezuela's economy will be stronger by then, but it will still cause another episode of economic crisis and perhaps another wave of migration. So sometimes I'm not completely sure if the Venezuelan government is making the right decisions, or maybe if I'm just too radical. Because, for instance, I think that Venezuela shouldn't be selling oil to the United States. We shouldn't allow Chevron to return to Venezuela. Why put ourselves in a position where the US can take away these relief measures and impose collective punishment again? So, of course, I understand and I know that selling oil to the US and to Europe is the fastest and probably the easiest way for Venezuela to recover oil production and to increase oil revenue, which translates into economic improvements. And this is especially important for the Maduro government as we enter an electoral year. I also understand that Venezuela has a debt with Chevron, and that is one of the main motivations for Chevron to take Venezuelan oil so they can recover millions in accumulated debt. But still, I think that from Venezuelans' point of view, it is a mistake to do business with the US. It is a mistake to make a deal with the devil expecting the best, especially now when SEC devil, the United States, is funding a genocide in Gaza. So how can we continue doing business and selling oil to a country that could easily reimpose sanctions against Venezuelans, reimpose collective punishment, a country that it is currently defending the killing and bombing of children in Gaza? So to me, it doesn't make any sense that we are denouncing US imperialism and at the same time doing business with them.
I do think that our listeners should understand that these so-called sanctions relief, which doesn't mean that the sanctions have been lifted. Of course, it just means that there's been that the OFAC has issued some licenses, but this so-called sanctions relief comes after the October 17 Barbados Accords between the opposition and the Maduro government. And indeed, as Ricardo was pointing at, actually the sanctions have become a problem for a sector of the opposition in the sense that the government has been able to make it visible that the opposition has been one of the factors promoting the sanctions. And of course, everybody knows about the devastating impact of the sanctions. So that's one reason why there's this situation right now. But as we know, it's a very precarious situation. I just wanted to point to a couple of things. We recently published an infographic, which is called Resistance and Dialogue on Venezuelanalysis, which is actually explains kind of like the current situation in relation to the sanctions. And of course, I'm also pointing to our readers to read our new book, to download our new book, which is online, A War Without Bombs, which is on the impact of the US sanctions. There is, of course, a lot to talk about the sanctions and its impact, but they happen in a complex and multifaceted context.
Absolutely. And part of that context is, why did this easing of sanctions actually come about? And as we know, they came as a result of an agreement that was signed between the Nicolás Maduro's government and the US-backed unitary platform that established certain conditions for the 2024 presidential elections. Now, the US has actually insisted that this deal, the Barbados Accords, as they've come to be called, means that the hardline opposition should be able to present whatever candidate it chooses. In this case, it would be the far-right figure, María Corina Machado. We know she won the opposition primary in a landslide, But we also know she's disqualified from office. And so, as a result of US pressure, the government and the main opposition parties agreed to this procedure that would see these candidates who are presently barred be able to file an appeal before the Supreme Court. But in a surprise to no one, we saw that Machado said she would not avail herself of this option. And so at the same time, we saw that the Electoral Court ratified the suspension of the primary process, essentially rendering her victory moot and leaving her in a precarious position as to whether or not she's actually going to be able to be on the ballot. Now, María Corina Machado isn't exactly popular in Venezuela or even within her political coalition. So what's going to happen? Is she going to be turfed? Will she be replaced? Will the opposition go back to this strategy of violence, of fascistic actions ahead of the vote? Basically, I'm asking, what happens next when it comes to the 2024 election?
Well, first, perhaps our listeners many of them will know who María Corina Machado is, but she's an opposition leader, and she is disqualified because she should be disqualified. She promoted the 2017 guarimbas, the violent street protest that led to some 150 people dying and really wreaking havoc in the city of Caracas and around the country. So obviously somebody who promotes basically fascistic street protest, I think in any country would be disqualified from running. So the Venezuelan opposition is one of the things that we should understand when we analyze Venezuela is that the opposition in Venezuela is actually has a difficulty uniting, a big difficulty coming together. And the fact that María Corina Machado will not be able to run is probably actually really not a problem for a lot of sectors within the opposition. They are actually probably happy to not have to have her as a contender, because in fact within the opposition she would be undeniably the one who would gather most votes. There's no question about that. So the other sectors of the opposition are probably happy that she is disqualified, and they probably won't activate too much to requalify her. They will probably have to make some symbolic move for her to be requalified, but I don't think at the end of the day they'll really work hard for it. So the Supreme Court just ratified the disqualification of María Corina, and as you were saying, José Luis, María Corina, who's in the she has always this drive to make sure that she disregards all the let's say political, legal, and democratic apparatus of Venezuela. She said that she would not appeal it. So that's just part of her modus operandi. There's nothing to be surprised there. What will happen? I mean, of course, we don't have the crystal ball, but I think that María Corina will actually do a campaign through the end, and that's going to generate contradictions, perhaps at the street level. But I think that right now the Venezuelan people are not too prone to engage in street protest. I mean, even the opposition, they are not very committed to that form of a struggle. So I think that we are most likely to see in the future, in the 2024 presidential elections, several opposition candidates, and María Corina will not be in the ticket, and then we will see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, Cira said most of it, and it's notoriously dangerous to make predictions in Venezuela. But it's very interesting how María Corina has become a problem for the opposition. I don't think there's too much importance on the Supreme Court actually declaring that the primaries are not valid, because, I mean, within the opposition circles that are already granted María Corina the legitimacy, and especially because she won in such a landslide. So now it's a problem, because she has said, as you were both just recapping, that she is not going to appeal against her ban. She said she has nothing to appeal, which is, of course, the most predictable thing that could happen. But at the same time, she has also said more than once that she's not going to step aside for a different candidate. So this puts the opposition, and here I'm talking about let's say the dialogue team in Barbados and these mainstream factors who have the political parties and are more organized. They are in a bit of a bind because on one hand, they cannot go against Maria Corina because she has this, as limited as it can be, this legitimacy of having won the primaries. But at the same time, they want to actually present a serious candidate who can challenge Maduro in the 2024 presidential election. So they need to at least look like they're fighting to get Maria Corina reinstated while trying, and I don't think they're going to be successful, trying to convince Maria Corina to step aside and actually actively support a candidate, because it's very possible that she's going to continue in this hardline position. And here I agree with Cira. I don't think there's not just the mood for street protests, but I don't think there's the strength for street protests after all these years and after all the exhaustion that the opposition has gone through. So I think she's going to try and force her line that she's going to be the candidate and she's not going to step aside. The other opposition factors are going to, say, let's be realistic and present their own candidate. And, this is going to split the field. And then at the end, Maria Corina will either lead to abstention or she'll support somebody else. But, I just said it was dangerous to make predictions, and here I am making predictions. But I think it's going to lead to the eternal issue of the opposition not being able to get a unified strategy, and that ultimately working to the benefit of Chavismo.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the issue that's been in the headlines all over social media, which is the territorial dispute with Guyana. So we saw this new political front open up as a result. We're seeing this becoming a major issue for Venezuela domestically, but also internationally. Now, putting aside the legal details of Venezuela's legitimate claim, to be honest, it seems like Venezuela mostly stands alone on this issue. China, which is a key ally of Venezuela, has oil interests in these disputed waters. CARICOM, which had good relations with Venezuela, particularly as a result of Petrocaribe, has rallied behind Guyana. So even on social media, you see people who are starting to treat Guyana as a victim of so-called Venezuelan aggression. And we're seeing the repeat of some of the language that the State Department has used, calling it a communist dictatorship and all that. All that to say, it seems like people outside of the country don't really realize Venezuela's claim, and that Venezuela has always viewed the Essequibo region as their rightful territory. Even on the maps, for the longest time, it said Territorio en Reclamación, a territory that is in process of being restored. Now, if you could help our listeners understand, where does Venezuela's claim stand from? We've seen the government already take some steps to follow through on the referendum's mandate, this referendum that happened that very recently that declared that they reject the international court, that they defend this claim to the region. So with the government already taking steps on that, is a military conflict for Venezuela and Guyana on the horizon?
Yes, this is definitely the subject that everyone is talking about. It is understandably because there's a lot of saying that there is a conflict that it is brewing there. So, but like you said, Venezuela has always considered the Essequibo territory as part of the country. So this isn't something new for Venezuela. It isn't something that we just suddenly made up in the last few years. Venezuela has considered the Essequibo to be part of the territory since it gained independence from Spain in the early 1800s. However, in 1899, an arbitration award granted the Essequibo to the United Kingdom, which was Guyana's former colonizer. So Guyana has had control over the Essequibo ever since 1899. Nonetheless, Venezuela has always fought against this ruling because the panel didn't have any Venezuelan negotiators, so Venezuelan interests weren't being represented during these times. So eventually, in 1966, Venezuela managed to finally revive this subject about the Essequibo, and that is when both parties, Guyana and the United Kingdom and Venezuela, signed the Geneva Agreement. which is an agreement that basically it says that Guyana and Venezuela have to find a negotiated solution to the Essequibo Territorial Dispute, and they have to find this solution talking as two independent states without the intromission of the United Kingdom or any other former colonizer. The problem is that nothing happened. I mean, the agreement was there, but there were no talks, no discussion, no further agreements. So the dispute sort of like it became something that both countries began to ignore. And although the legal battle was still there, but nothing was happening. Of course, there were several points in history when Venezuela tried to revive this legal battle. But like I said, there was really no conflict. And the problem is that once we find out that ExxonMobil and Guyana found oil in 2015 in the Essequibo waters, then that's when the conflict becomes really important, because now we're talking about a massive amount of resources in the Essequibo that Guyana is planning to exploit with ExxonMobil, which is a corporation that, as we know, it is responsible for environmental crimes in Latin America and around the world. So yes, since then, since 2015, it is really when the conflict began to grow. And because Guyana, of course, saw its own economic interest being threatened, it went to the International Court of Justice in 2018 to try to have the ICJ to uphold the ruling of 1899. Venezuela, however, doesn't recognize the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, so the case is being reviewed by the court, but Caracas hasn't really accepted that the court has the jurisdiction to review the case. Well, ever since this process in the ICJ began, we've seen like this battle of wars between Venezuela and Guyana, and we've seen the conflict sort of like arise in these last few months. I personally don't see a military conflict happening, because I think neither country is going to win. They will both come out with even weaker economies, and they will both become vulnerable to foreign intervention. And I think both the Venezuelan and the Guyana governments know this. So far, what I see is a lot of senseless bravado from both nations, while both governments are ignoring the needs and the feelings of the people who are actually living in the Essequibo. So nobody has asked them what they want. Nobody has asked the Essequibo people if they want to be part of Venezuela, if they want to be part of Guyana, or if they want to be independent. So now, about Guyana being perceived as the victim of Venezuelan aggression, I don't truly agree with this, because Venezuela has never threatened with the use of military force. It has never said they are going to invade the Essequibo or anything like that. Guyana, on the other hand, has invited foreign armies to defend the Essequibo, including the U.S. Southern Command. And that is extremely dangerous and mostly stupid thing to do when you take into consideration how the U.S. has destroyed countries around the world with their armies. So that said, I do understand why Guyana will feel threatened, given Venezuela is a bigger country. And I also understand that from Guyana's point of view, they will be losing some, 60% of their territory. And of course, personally, that doesn't sit well with me. So this also explains why countries like Brazil and even Cuba are supporting Guyana, which additionally is a nation that it is still trying to overcome poverty and inequalities left by centuries of colonization. So yeah, I think that explains why these countries are supporting Guyana primarily. Although I do think that most of these nations agree that the best solution is simply to talk and to find a negotiated solution to the disputed territory. About the measures that President Maduro announced that were perceived as something aggressive as well, let me name some of them. So President Maduro said that he was going to propose a law to create a new Venezuelan state called Guyana Essequibo. And Venezuela is going to offer the people in the Essequibo Venezuelan identity cards and social programs. Maduro also ordered the Venezuelan state oil company PDVSA to begin granting licenses for oil exploration in the Essequibo. Something we can only assume is something that could happen in the future if Venezuela wins the legal battle and recovers the Essequibo. Because at the moment, none of these measures really matter because Venezuela is not in a position to enter the Essequibo territory because it does not control that land, and Venezuela is also not in the interest of sparking a military confrontation. So I believe these measures announced by Maduro are mainly to reassure the Venezuelan people that he is doing everything in his power to recover the Essequibo, that Venezuela is ready to welcome the Essequibo population, and also to prove that the government has plans, has future plans for the territory and its resources that could be continued by future presidents of Venezuela who inherit the legal battle. And to be honest, given the criminal history of US corporations in Latin America, ideally, I would prefer if Guyana and Venezuela unite against ExxonMobil, unite against Chevron, against the United States, and that they will find a way to use the resources in the Essequibo to improve living conditions for the people in the Essequibo and for the people of both nations. I mean, ultimately, the real enemy here will always be the United States, will always be the corporations that are trying to exploit our territories.
Yeah, just to add something quick, Andreína already gave a great summary. I would recommend people go to our website because we also published an infographic on the Essequibo Dispute, really trying to trace these basically 200 years of dispute and the most important flashpoints along the way. And I think this final point is where I wanted to jump in. There's been a war of words and a lot of bravado from both sides. There's a heightening of tensions across the border, which, again, I agree with Andreína, and I really hope I'm not wrong about this. I don't think there's going to be a military conflict. It would really contradict Venezuela's international position over the years. I mean, Venezuela has, even to a fault, always harped on this chord of international law and all of that. So Venezuela really is insisting on a return to direct talks. And of course, it's trying to leverage its position as best as possible, even with some we could call premature announcement. That being said, the issue of oil is really where it all comes down to. And one thing that I kind of wished was more in the discourse is this idea that Andreína was making of that the two countries and the entire region, the Caribbean region, should identify this common enemy of U.S. imperialism. And there are precedents. I mean, Petrocaribe was a precedent that saw how natural resources in the region could be used for the development, kind of autonomous, independent development of these small Caribbean nations on favorable conditions, without the impositions of U.S. imperialism or corporate interests. And in the case of Guyana, the same thing. I mean, we just stumbled upon an expose by The Intercept, which said something like, it's not clear where ExxonMobil ends and where the Guyanese government begins. So it really is an outsized influence of this corporation. And here, there are alternatives, there are precedents. There's the blueprint of how Venezuela dealt with oil corporations during the Chavez years, imposing sovereignty, imposing much more favorable conditions for the state, and that in turn translating to social programs and all of that. So I think that's a part that has been missing in this kind of escalating issue, with the looming shadow of U.S. imperialist intervention. There were some suggestions by Lula da Silva yesterday of setting up some mediation. I think that will be useful, and I'll also bring in a kind of regional perspective to de-escalate tensions and hopefully put this issue of the region uniting, as opposed to letting foreign powers sow division.
Yeah, absolutely. Wholeheartedly agree, especially in the sense that there's almost an inclination of some people, some observers, to treat this as if it's some kind of schoolyard disagreement with one country bullying another. We need to look at the class dynamics at play. Well, who are the actors involved in this? What role does ExxonMobil play? What is U.S. capital doing? What is U.S. imperialism doing here? and not get too confused, and also appreciate that there's been this historical effort to portray Venezuela in a negative light in the international community. And by that, I mean with this effort to take them to the International Criminal Court. Now we're seeing this language of them trying to be a bully or being aggressive and all of that. And then actually brings me to my final question, which is about a conversation I would like to have about what's still happening in Venezuela. There is still a very radical political process happening, maybe under the radar, but it's there. And so I want to talk about the continued efforts to build popular power in Venezuela. It's a topic that too often gets marginalized. On the 11th anniversary of former President Hugo Chávez's final major public speech, the strike at the helm, el golpe de timón, something that we've covered frequently on this podcast, President Maduro held a meeting in Caracas with popular movements. And as a result of that gathering, the president handed over some state assets, he promised money to support the communal economic circuits, and said that the government would prioritize the purchases of communal production. But as we saw in the coverage on our website, these grassroots organizations have voiced concerns that amidst this US blockade, the Maduro administration has actually increasingly favored private sector, the interests of private capital, this in addition to many other measures that have not been favorable towards these popular movements, towards the grassroots. The Communal Union, which for those of you who don't know, it's an alliance that brings together more than 60 communes from 15 different states, put out a very strong communique with very specific proposals to boost social production that included many long-standing demands that they say have gone underaddressed for years. So it would seem that there's a bit of a gap between the president's rhetoric and the situation on the ground in Venezuela. Where do things stand when it comes to the efforts of grassroots organizations to build popular power in Venezuela? Does the sanctions relief open a path to the construction of a communal state, as Chavez demanded in the golpe de timón, in the strike at the helm before his passing?
So this is actually perhaps one of our main focuses at Venezuelanalysis, right? So we really try to understand, and we are committed to the grassroots and communal organization in Venezuela. So indeed, in this meeting that you were mentioning, José Luis, in this mass meeting in which Maduro met with some 15,000 people, commonards, there was a kind of an interesting situation because there was some talk about promoting the communal economic circuits, which is good, but that's actually already happening. The communal economic circuits are spaces between communes where communes exchange their production and they have a little bit of support from the government through the Ministry of Communes. That's a very good initiative. It's a small-scale initiative, but it's a good one. So kind of like Maduro talked about this initiative, but he also talked about other purchases. And it was clear, and we know that most of the purchases that are being done by the Venezuelan government are precisely not done to communes. And the communes, well, many of the communes there, including the bloc of the Communal Union, kind of like expressed their dissent to the way that things were being handled. Indeed, the Communal Union made released a very clear statement, like something like 2 days before, proposing that there should be actual support for the promotion of communal organization. Now, I think that this conversation is more interesting when we take it beyond this specific situation. Of course, Chavez reminded us once and again that we live in a capitalist society and that our state is bourgeois. But at the same time, there's the emergence of a new form of producing and distributing wealth through the communes. And the two are necessarily in contradiction. So how do you do it? You have a bourgeois state, you have a government that sometimes looks favorably on the communes and sometimes ignores the communes. And you have, of course, a number of communes, perhaps 100 or 200 communes that are really working very hard to build new social relations in the territory. So how do you deal with this dialectic of building the new in a capitalist society when the state, be it all in a very economically problematic situation due to the US blockade. But when the state is actually the haver of most of the resources in Venezuela. And what I mean by this is that the Venezuelan bourgeoisie in the past and in the present is highly dependent on the state. So what do communes do? What are communes to do in this situation? And communes indeed have to struggle for resource, but they also have to struggle simultaneously for autonomy. So that's kind of like the dialectic of a revolution. There's something new emerging, and there's the old forms are still there. There's tremendous contradictions, and there's a dispute. There's actually tensions going back and forth, the communes demanding more, and the state perhaps giving a little bit more, and then retreating back, and so forth. So what we've been seeing in this last year is a little bit of this, the communes kind of like demanding what is rightly theirs, and the resources that they actually need to be able to not only survive, but to become a real reference. And the state sometimes granting some resources, and in this case, through in the case of the mass meeting with Nicolas Maduro, we actually see that when the communes demand something, there can be a response from the government, in this case from Nicolas Maduro. But since that event happened until now, we haven't seen any kind of like concrete steps towards transferring the resources that the communes need so that they can really produce on scale. And of course, the objective is not to compete with the capitalist system, but to actually make it visible that the communes can actually produce, and the communes will be producing not for capital, but for the people.
Yeah, Cira already pretty much said it all. Again, just to plug in content, people should look at our series of communal and working class resistance. This is a series of interviews by Cira and sometimes with Chris Gilbert too, to document, understand, really ask the difficult questions about how communes are surviving in these very difficult circumstances. José Luis, you were mentioning sanctions relief in your question when you were bringing up the topic and how that can affect popular power. I think we have to first look in the opposite direction, how sanctions really were a very hard blow for popular organizations, for all the economic destruction that they brought, even driving migration, making it even harder for communes to have any kind of autonomous productive apparatus. So now there is sanctions relief, and there's a big question, how are the new resources going to be distributed? Because in recent years, amidst these very complicated circumstances, what we've seen from the government has been a liberal and even very pragmatic way of operating. Sometimes just taking the most obvious solution, which is in the most case kind of orthodox economic measures that we're used to in other parts of the world, and not looking at the potential that exists here with popular power. And there have been plenty of demonstrations over the years that we have talked about and documented. And so that's why it's very interesting that communes actually stand up and make themselves heard, even in these very limited scenarios that we see in these televised broadcasts, to show that they are here and they have this capacity to produce. But at the same time, again, going back to something Chavez once said, we cannot convert everything we produce into merchandise. We cannot build socialism with the damaged tools of capitalism, just like what was it? Just like turtles don't climb trees and armadillos don't shave. Chavez also always had a way with words. But that goes to say that just in the same way as the bourgeoisie is and has always been very dependent on state support, it's important to fight for this and to not just assume that communes can get into the capitalist market and fight. I mean, they are in a disadvantage compared to this large corporation and these historical monopolies, and so they have to fight while maintaining their autonomy to really push forward these new social relations and their own production amidst again very difficult circumstances.
Well, I just wanted to say thanks to everybody for participating. I always think that this is a good opportunity for our listeners and readers to get to know us a little bit, to understand the viewpoints of the people here on the Venezuela Analysis team who are able to share their incredible insights with everybody here on the program. I want to remind everybody that we're in the midst of our fundraiser. We're actually celebrating our 20th anniversary. It's kind of hard to believe. Venezuela Analysis has been around for 2 decades now. So we're asking for your support to continue our work. Your donation to Venezuela Analysis will help us maintain our production and actually scale up our work. Be sure to check out our website for regular news and analysis on all things Venezuela. I think we can confidently say that much of the topics that we talked about today, popular power, the Essequibo, the upcoming elections, sanctions relief, these are going to be the major issues that we're going to see in the next year in 2024. And I think it's important for us to be able to keep up with what's happening so that we're able to have an appreciation of what's actually happening in Venezuela. And so you can always count on Venezuela Analysis for that on-the-ground coverage. And remember, we're everywhere on social media, from Telegram to Instagram, and of course, Twitter. I want to remind everybody that if you enjoyed the program, please check out our older episodes. We have quite a long series, over 20 episodes now, covering various topics, including many of the ones we touched on today. And if you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends. Again, visit VenezuelaAnalysis.com. And if you're able to,